Well, good day, everybody, and welcome to the learning edition of 5-Minute Psych. In this 5-minute segment, we'll look at classical conditioning, which is a type of associative learning. We'll begin by looking at the classical conditioning procedure using an example. Then we'll consider some additional procedures before examining some applications of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning can happen whenever you have an important stimulus, like food or something painful, for example, that is reliably signaled by a neutral stimulus, like a light or a tone. Because the learner cares about the important stimulus, learning to associate cues that predict its arrival gives a huge advantage. Now you can get ready for that important stimulus because you know it's coming. For instance, I had a guinea pig named Sammy that squeaked loudly whenever I gave her lettuce. In this example, the lettuce would be an important stimulus to Sammy, and in classical conditioning terms, we would call this an unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned because Sammy didn't have to learn about the lettuce. She was born knowing that she loved lettuce, and it made her squeak automatically. The squeaking is called the unconditioned response because it's the response that is unlearned to the unconditioned stimulus. So far, Sammy hasn't learned anything, but here's the exciting part. The lettuce always came in a plastic bag that made a distinctive rustling sound when I picked the leaves. At first, the sound was meaningless to Sammy, and she didn't react at all to the sound of the plastic rustling. But after a while, the sound of plastic rustling made Sammy squeak just as much as if she was being given lettuce. The plastic rustling sound is a neutral stimulus that didn't elicit a response at first, but after a few trials of hearing that sound before getting lettuce, it did. In classical conditioning terms, the plastic rustling sound would be called the conditioned stimulus. Conditioned because it was learned about. The squeaking to the plastic rustling sound is called the conditioned response. And this is how you would measure learning in classical conditioning. You would look for the conditioned response, squeaking to the plastic rustling sound alone. Here are some additional terms and procedures found in classical conditioning. Stimulus generalization is the tendency to see a conditioned response to stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. In other words, you see responses to more stimuli. With Sammy, she began to squeak not only to the sound of plastic rustling, but also to the sound of keys jingling. Stimulus discrimination is the tendency to see a conditioned response only to a specific conditioned stimulus and not to other similar stimuli. So you see responses to less stimuli. With Sammy, she eventually realized that keys have nothing to do with lettuce, and she learned to distinguish the sound of plastic from keys by only squeaking to the plastic. Finally, with higher order conditioning, this is when a previously conditioned stimulus acts like an unconditioned stimulus for a different neutral stimulus. With Sammy, she learned that the sound of the fridge door always preceded the sound of the plastic rustling, and soon she was squeaking whenever she heard the fridge. Many students don't see that classical conditioning is all around them and that it has applications anytime you have a neutral stimulus that reliably comes before an important stimulus. For instance, classical conditioning can explain how a phobia might develop. A neutral stimulus like a cat, for example, is paired with the pain of a scratch. It can also explain drug cravings, because when neutral stimuli like a lighter or belt are paired with the effects of a drug, they can trigger those cravings. Classical conditioning is also involved in taste aversions. When we eat something and then we get sick on it, we can end up pairing the flavor of that food with illness, and then we feel sick just at the thought of eating that food again. It could also be involved in breastfeeding, where the sound of the baby's cry can be enough to trigger the milk letdown reflex. Finally, we see classical conditioning used in advertising when products are paired with celebrities in hopes that we will think of those products more favorably. Really, classical conditioning is all around us. Well, we just looked at the classical conditioning procedure and we used an example to add clarity. Then we discussed some additional terms and procedures found in classical conditioning before looking at applications in the real world. Now, aren't you glad you had 5 minutes?